Greetings to you all on World Water Day 2021. My name is Alan Williams, and I'm happy to join this conversation on water, especially because of the theme of this year's observation. This year, World Water Day 2021 is focused on the wider theme of how we should value our water. The focus is inviting us to go a little further than valuing water on the basis of the cost and price that we individually pay. It is asking us to understand the environmental, social, and cultural value that people must place on water. So the invitation this year is to expand our vision of the value of water by combining our knowledge of our water resource with an awareness of the importance it is to us as individual citizens on the island of Dominica, but also as a member state within the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. We have two words that capture this merging of knowledge and awareness. We call it water wisdom. So when we seek to raise the profile of water in our national dialogue, we are doing so to create a platform of water wisdom from which we can make wiser decisions about the disposition of our water resources. I am suggesting that these cannot only be decisions on how we should use our water resources, but also how we should share our water resources. Because, as you will see, our national water resources have placed Dominica in an exceptional situation with respect to the rest of the Eastern Caribbean. But before I get into the analysis of how exceptional the freshwater resources of Dominica are, allow me to share a short story which will demonstrate to you just where Dominica was with respect to water wisdom some 50 years ago. My first visit to Dominica was in 1971, 50 years ago. This was the beginning of an intense period of road paving in the island. In fact, if my memory serves me well, all of this road paving activity spurred a very popular folk song with the chorus, Chimé Vive la Plaine. So I took the initiative to assume that more roads meant more cars. And as such, I suggested to my new Dominican friend that a good venture to get into at that time would be a car wash business. Well, his response was very swift. Garçon, why would I bring my car to wash by you when I could easily drive it into the river and wash it there for free? He further advised me, the only way that car wash would prosper is if the government banned people from washing their car in the river. Well, they subsequently did. But looking back at this conversation today, what was most startling was his concluding remark. Compare, even if they passed that law, the police would have a very hard time enforcing it because there are so many rivers in Dominica where you can go and wash your car. So here was my friend telling me confidently that Dominica was an island with an abundance of water resources. But at the same time, he was exhibiting very little awareness of what the consequences of his car washing practice in the river would entail. Building respect for the abundant supply of fresh water in Dominica is a major challenge that water wisdom has to address. Now let me start by explaining this exceptionalism that characterizes water wisdom in Dominica. If you were to ask me if the concerns about water in Dominica shouldn't be the same as the concerns in, say, Antigua or in St. Kitts Nevis, I would say to you, definitely not. It is different. Why? Well, because all of the other islands have to develop their awareness within the context of water scarcity. It is only in Dominica that we have to approach this challenge from a position of a water surplus. Accept this as your first cognizance of exceptionalism. So what does exceptionalism look like in Dominica? We know that Dominica has more available freshwater per capita than any other Eastern Caribbean island. But when you understand that your available water resources are 250% above the FAO recommended minimum level per individual, 200% more than the available water in the next neighbor, Antigua, and 33% higher than in the next highest OECS member state, Grenada. That is exceptionalism, which means that we have to consider ourselves as being uniquely advantaged when it comes to water availability. But here is the challenge that comes with this awareness. It is much easier to build an understanding in the national consciousness of how valuable water is from a context of scarcity than it is from a context of a surplus supply. How so? Well, we have to go back to the simple economic reality. Water is a commodity that everyone needs, right? But under the condition of scarcity, people are willing to pay for it. Under the conditions of a surplus supply, don't be surprised if people think that they should have it and be able to use it for free. So the first thing that we have to be aware of is that Dominica's abundant freshwater supply has a greater value to us in the regional context than it has in the local context, and that it is exceptionalism that will become the first foundation block for building a knowledgeable discourse on water in Dominica. So how do we know how well we are facing up to this knowledge awareness challenge? Well, there is a competency test for water wisdom that goes beyond simply having the factual knowledge. It has two parts. The first part is that you must present your wisdom as being logical. That means it must confirm the logic of economic theory. But there is a second part of this test that is seldom realized. It is that your wisdom should not be contradicted by your historical experience with that logic. Not only do you have to know the logic of economic theory, but now you also have to make sure that your decisions do not repeat your history with such economic ideas. There are some sound reasons for telling you about this test. You see, economic logic can handle scarcity very well. Economics builds its foundation on how to allocate scarce resources. But when it comes to the allocation of resources in surplus supply, economic logic has been nothing short of disastrous, especially for those of us who unfortunately happen to be part of that surplus supply. The thing that you have to remember is this. In making wise decisions about water, you can choose your logic, but you should not allow those who are advising you to ignore your history. Now, our history has a lot of lessons about the misuse of resources in surplus supply. In the plantation economy, land was freely available to the planters because it was abundant. So also was the abundance of forced labor of enslaved Africans, and that became a powerful logical solution for 300 years. But we all know how that turned out for us. The logic that created the slave economy benefited more the industrialists in Liverpool, Manchester, and Glasgow, Scotland. But for us, the descendants of the enslaved population, it turned out to be an historical experience that has left us today fighting to get reparations for that part of the wealth that our forefathers created for the other side. In a sense, this logic repeated itself in the more recent colonial economy. One of the greatest thinkers produced in the West Indies was our own Sir Arthur Lewis of St. Lucia. In 1954, Sir Arthur published a paper in the Manchester School entitled Economic Development with Unlimited Supplies of Labor. He created a concept of a surplus labor economy, which became one of the most frequently cited ideas upon which the policy of industrialization by invitation was pursued in the Caribbean for 60 years of independence. We are still struggling to find a meaningful model for economic growth and development today. So now we can see the beginning of water wisdom in Dominica in a not too complicated manner. We have exceptionalism, which is meant to inform us that our land-based ecosystem is producing an abundance of water here in Dominica, while this is not the case in the rest of the Eastern Caribbean. We have pluralism, which alerts us to the fact that in a surplus supply system, there are always more than one way of dispensing with our abundant resource, and that we need to use both logic and historical experience to choose between the options. Now, there are two other aspects behind the scene. Behind the options variable in pluralism is a third aspect, which is to realize the value of water in an even wider perspective. That is, by making water the fixed reference point in our discourse. We are accustomed to referring to Dominica as the nature island of the Caribbean. But try explaining this phenomenon by using science, literature, culture, and applied technology. We will come to the inevitable conclusion that our island is nature dominated because of the abundance of water its ecosystem generates. In other words, the Dominican landscape would not look this green were it not for the abundance of water generated within the ecosystem. Finally, there is an aspect behind exceptionalism, which is the profile of regionalism, which allows us to use our water to strengthen our ties with the rest of the Eastern Caribbean by managing our surplus water as a regional asset that has a very critical role to play in the solution of a regional water crisis. Let me explain where this is coming from. This is the map that shows Dominica with a substantial water surplus, surrounded by all these islands to the north who continue to operate under huge monthly water deficits. The logic of the map is manifestly clear that Dominica should be selling some of its surplus water to its Eastern Caribbean neighbors. Now that is the logical conclusion. So why aren't we doing that? Well, it is not only economic logic that will give us some guidance, but also the economic history of trading in bulk water supplies between nations. Let me tell you what that history says. There are at least 30 countries where over 50% of their usable water supply comes from outside of their national borders. But in every one of these cases, the initiative for such a trade has always originated from the demand side of the market, not the supply side. So what does this mean? Well, if you run around touting that you have surplus water for sale, you will not get very many buyers. What you have to demonstrate by your wise and prodigious use of your water surplus is that Dominica has both the intent and capability of providing additional water supplies to our water-stressed neighbors to solve the region's water crisis. Then, when they make the initiative from the demand side, we must be in a position to supply. So in a sense, the call this year is to make water wisdom a teaching moment. First, we have to recognize that our water resource endowment is exceptional because it's in surplus. Second, we need to ensure that the decision spectrum on how we use and dispose of our water resource should reflect pluralism and not a singular purpose. Third, we have to learn good water stewardship. And fourth, we have to make water a fixed reference point. Let us look even closer into this third takeaway, water stewardship. The awareness of the value of our water in our system means that every one of us has to play a stewardship role. It doesn't matter whether we are wardens, curators, farmers, superintendents, guardians, rural custodians, physical planners, citizen journalists. Tout moon, we all have to stand up and demand national policies that will strengthen our private and public water stewardship. Interestingly, the policies we have to defend are more likely to be policies about land use than about water use. You see, we know most of the things that need to be done, such as integrated water management approach, preserving the forest reserve, and protecting the water catchment areas. So what water wisdom is teaching us this year is to enhance the value of water by our stewardship of the land that facilitates the abundance of water in our ecosystem. So how do we do all of this? Well, here is a simplified algorithm of water wisdom which will take us there, starting with an acknowledgement of the context and the status of our water resource and a recognition of the trending national conditions. Then we have to institutionalize the policy cultures and use that as an envelope for strategies and actions in support of sustainable results. Here's a table that shows us some of the content of this algorithm. But the most important thing about water exceptionalism in Dominica is that it thrusts on us an obligation to educate the rest of the Caribbean, especially the regional institutions, to the role that Dominica's surplus water situation is positioned to play in resolving the region's water crisis. So what happens if we fail to establish these protocols of a meaningful water wisdom curriculum here in Dominica? One of the serious consequences of failing to do this is that we will continue to see clueless solutions coming out of our regional institutions as they try to implement a solution to the freshwater crisis in the other islands. Here are a couple of examples. Let us take the case of the OECS Assembly. I don't know how many of you know about this institution called the OECS Assembly. The OECS Assembly is the equivalent of the European Parliament in the European Union. It comprises of representatives from each parliament in each member state. Over the last 10 years, it has met only 4 times. The last one, I believe, was in the 18th of June 2019. But in July 2016, the United States government, through the USAID, financed a project to write a model water law for the OECS members. It was free to them, so they readily approved and adopted it wholeheartedly. But the basic principle of this law was this: water needs to be managed as a national resource through a legal framework to achieve food security, livelihood, and an equitable, sustainable development for all. When they say national, they mean island specific. So in their language, Dominica's water is to be managed for Dominica, and Antigua's water supply is to be limited to the supply within its political boundary, period. In the first case, I don't know why the authors of this law thought it necessary to give us guidance in something we already know. The water authorities in the Caribbean have always treated their water resource as a national asset, and that is the source of their problem today. It is actually the opposite of this premise that would make more sense for us. You see, the basic condition for a trade in Dominica's surplus water to emerge is that water in the Eastern Caribbean needs to be managed as a regional resource in which Dominica's supply can play a pivotal role. The second case of cluelessness comes to us from our own Caribbean Development Bank. In June 2018, the CDB approved $150,000 to fund a training for trainers workshop in the Caribbean on how to integrate climate resilience into the regional water sector. Of course, this was paid for by the UK government, who hired British expertise to compile the training manual and to conduct the training. The project claimed to have trained 60 water sector practitioners from over 15 countries, that is all of CARICOM. But wait, nowhere within the 9 sessions listed here are the trainees ever presented with a rainfall or a water deficit map of the islands of the Eastern Caribbean, or even with a concept of water deficits. In all of its 314 pages, there is no reference in the manual to Dominica as being the only water surplus island in the region. Maybe they just don't know, or we are to blame for not educating them. Just when we thought we were making progress in trading some of Dominica's freshwater supplies to the Eastern Caribbean, this happened. Arctic Blue Waters, a major freshwater transshipment company, suddenly in 2016 discovered Dominica's water surplus and quickly moved to announce a deal to export 63 million gallons per month, not to the Caribbean islands where fresh water is scarce, but to the Gulf states where cash is plentiful. Notice their hashtag line, "Now is the time to get long" in bulk water, meaning this is the investment for the future. What was more disturbing was the way in which Arctic Blue Waters used its water wisdom. For on the same page that they were expounding on the Caribbean water deficit amid droughts, they were boasting in a tweet of signing a major contract to export 63 million gallons per month from the only source that could possibly help to resolve that Caribbean problem. This also happened coming out of Suriname. A group of investors thought they had found a golden mine in the water deficit problems of the Caribbean islands. However, they planned a big splash to ship 1 million gallons of fresh water free of charge in the first instance from Suriname to Barbados. They recognized the difficulty of initiating such a trade from the supply side. Fortunately, none of these ventures ever came to fruition, and that's why you may not have heard of them. But the character of water wisdom in Dominica remains very specific. It is a challenge, it is a teaching moment, it is a fixed reference point, it is a platform for trade in bulk water supplies, it is a guide to common stewardship, it is a call for citizen journalism, it is a new water management system, it is a demand for supportive land-based policies, and it is an algorithm for water governance. It goes without saying that if we fail to build on our water wisdom, we will not only lose the benefits that can be gained from our abundant water resource, but we may be condemning our children's children 100 years from now to be petitioning for reparations from those whom we allowed in our lack of wisdom to steal the value of our water resource. Thank you.